when you look at major headwinds facing the industry, like aging infrastructure and labor shortages, and the level of service pressures, how are they reshaping the way project managers operate?
We work with a lot of clients who are the silver wave for their operations groups, their engineering groups. Right now, 20 to 30% of their workforce is eligible to retire. So 20, 30% of people are leaving. How do you backfill all those gaps? How do you make sure that knowledge is transferred? How do you do all that while
What happens when aging infrastructure, labor shortages, and rising service expectations all collide at the same time? For many project managers in the AEC industry, it means the old playbook simply won't work anymore. The pressure isn't just higher, it's different, and it's forcing PMs to rethink how they plan, lead, and make decisions across the entire project lifecycle. In today's episode, we're joined by William Kuehne, PE, MBA, ENV, SP, Project Manager and Utility Management Solutions Group Lead at Ardora. William works at the intersection of utilities, infrastructure, and project leadership, and he brings a grounded perspective on what's really changing in our industry. We'll talk about how industry headwinds are reshaping project management, how approaches need to shift from planning and design through construction and operations, and how AI and advanced analytics are influencing not just technical work, but the way teams collaborate and the risks firms face without strong governance. If you're leading infrastructure projects, working with aging systems, or trying to future-proof your firm's project delivery approach, this episode will challenge how you think about risk, innovation, and execution, so you can stay ahead instead of constantly reacting. Before we jump in, I want to tell you about something that's tailor-made for project managers in the AEC industry. It's called AEC PM Connect, and it's the event designed for PMs who want to level up how they deliver projects, communicate with teams, and lead with confidence, all through practical, real-world strategies and tools. The event will take place on June 10th, 2026 at the Forest Gate Country Club in New Jersey. You can register now at aecpmconnect.com. I'm your host, Fiona Johan, and this is the AEC Project Management Podcast. Let's jump right in. All right, it is now time for our PM Conversation of the Week with William Kuehne, PE, MBA, ENV, SP. William, welcome to the AEC Project Management Podcast.
thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us. I thought maybe we could start by you telling our listeners a bit about yourself and how it led you to focus, or yourself in your past, and how it led you to focus on project management and utility solutions.
Sure. So I think it stems back way when I was going to college. I've always been interested in the water space, but I've been interested in a variety of different pieces of the water space. I was interested in politics, the environment, and civil engineering when I was going through college. So I was in an interdisciplinary program and got into the water space and really enjoyed that. And then during COVID, I was on a project, it was a FEMA federal project, and got introduced into all these wonderful pieces of data that surrounds utilities, particularly on the wastewater side. It was about 7 years ago. And then I started getting very into data analytics, and it was COVID and it was easy to study. So started getting really into machine learning at the time. And that's just sort of spun out into AI and all these other things. But I think what's really fascinating about the water space is you can be very focused on water, but there are all these different components surrounding water that are interconnected. It's hard to see them in a vacuum, right? It's all these pieces get interconnected.
So you get
Um,
a big piece, a little piece of big puzzles, it sounds like.
right. Yeah.
That's great. And so when you look at major headwinds facing the industry, like aging infrastructure and labor shortages, and the level of service pressures, how are they reshaping the way project managers operate?
Yeah. So I think our clients are in particular are feeling those pressures, and ultimately they're having to do more with less. So we work with a lot of clients who are the silver wave for their operations groups, their engineering groups. It's like 20 to 30%. Right now, 20 to 30% of their workforce is eligible to retire. And that gap in and of itself is pretty amazing, especially for critical infrastructure, right? So 20, 30% of people are leaving. How do you backfill all those gaps? How do you make sure that knowledge is transferred? How do you do all of that while managing the demands of infrastructure that's at the end of its service life? A lot of infrastructure in the US was built in the 50s and 60s, 50-year design life. Maybe we can stretch it 70-year design life, 100-year design life. But a lot of those pieces of infrastructure are starting to come to the end of their useful life. So I think ultimately we just have to be able to do more with less. My view is that we can address it in a few ways. We can either hire more people and find more people to get into the industry, and I think that is needed. And there are a lot of programs out there. In Texas, there's a program called SEF, where people can get an operator D license straight out of high school, and so that's helping get more people into the labor force. But I also think that we can utilize technology to help fill the gap. So I think there's sort of an all of the above approach to helping us do more with less.
Strong project outcomes need skilled managers and competent leaders. EMI's corporate training delivers expert led courses in project management and people leadership, plus industry recognized certification and exclusive premium content to take your team even further. Elevate your team's leadership capabilities today. Visit engineeringmanagementinstitute.org and click on corporate training.
And along that line, when do you think tends to surprise people about managing those projects in the utility sector compared to other types of AEC projects? You kind of mentioned, a, a people shortage, but what else is surprising around that?
Yeah, so I think a lot of if you talk about asset management projects, AI, ML projects, sensing projects, things that are on the other side of the life cycle. So we think about the whole life cycle of an asset pump station, for example. I think we can start with monitoring. So we start with monitoring, we see what's going on, see if we need a new lift station, see if we need to do any rehab to that lift station, see if maybe we need a completely new lift station. We continue to go through that life cycle, and maybe we need to go do some condition assessment. We need to go into the field and understand what's happening. We need to identify what projects need to occur after we do all those condition assessments. We need to find funding. All those pieces, I haven't talked about design or construction yet. Those are all before the design and construction piece. And that's really where utilities are different than the traditional design engineering work, right? So typical design engineering work, we do 30, 60, 90 plan sets. There's delivery, there's closeout, there's as-builts, there are all these different components. There's almost like a formulaic approach to doing a design build. Not to say that design build follows a formula for every project. Every project is very unique. But in the utility space, there's almost a mix of software delivery methods and traditional engineering delivery methods. So we still sometimes do these 30, 60, 90 deliveries, but we also follow agile method. And in agile method, there are all these very constant check-ins. It's much more tighter collaboration with our clients. We engage with our clients at a more frequent interval. And there's more of an approach that sees things in this life cycle. And what I mean by that is it's building the ecosystem of people that can help with infrastructure in the long term. So in design build, once you've finished, there's a kind of a finish line that you cross and it's ended. But when you really get into the utility space, the utility doesn't end when a lift station is delivered. The utility is more of like an institution. It exists beyond all of its assets. And it just requires a different type of project delivery approach. I think people talk about people, process, and technology. Having all three of those filled in for the utility as a consultant is a really important piece to focus not just on delivering this one deliverable, but how do we make sure that the city has the resources to maintain this deliverable in the long term? How do we make sure that the technology is resilient? How do we make sure that all the processes are there so that this deliverable survives beyond just a year? It, it's just it's very different approach, but it's also very overlapped with engineering, like traditional engineering. It's an interesting space to be.
I think what I heard there that I think will speak to a lot of people too is that, you have different versions or different types of project management that you have to utilize in different places and spaces. And what I like here is, you've got that traditional path, but like you said, that agile method, that check-in, which really takes you back to the people more often, which is so critical with things that are shifting all the time. Like you said, you're not creating one end product. You want it to last a long, long time. How do you think, just going off a little, how do you like, do people respond to that well? Like, I know that sometimes that can be surprising to people when you're like constantly checking in. I think personally, like for my project management realm, that's the way I get anything done, right? I love that like constant interaction and checking. How does that translate for you?
Yeah, it's a great point. So I think at the beginning, it can be daunting because most engineers are used to these waterfall approaches where they have very large check-ins, these kickoff meetings that may last a day. They might have 30% submittals where it's kind of crunch time for a week or two. I think at the beginning of doing agile method, there's a lot of hesitancy. It seems like it's taking more time than a traditional design project, right? Because there are all these different check-ins that are happening immediately. I think at the end of the project, there's an appreciation because the deliverable is very aligned with what the client wants. And this alignment of the project team that's doing deliverable and the problem statement that the client has, they come together very well in Agile method. I've seen projects in the utility space that try to follow the 30-60-90 approach. And because there are just so many different paths, there's so many different ways of approaching the problems in the utility space. You can provide solutions that really aren't aligned with the client's problem, and avoiding that with agile is important. And people appreciate it at the end, but at the beginning, sometimes it can be there's a people management component to it.
It can definitely be daunting. And around that, I think we started to head here, but I guess I want to like more concretely pull out, you know, how do your project management approaches shift across different phases of the construction life cycle? So we've kind of hit on this, but from planning to design to construction operations, what like build out for me what that how that plays out for you using different project management techniques.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I think in the early phases, the monitoring phases, our deliverables are often automated. So we're trying, there are a lot of even project management components, particularly in the early stages, I think, of planning and design that can be automated. And there's a very interesting conversation going on right now in the AI space about whether humans should be in the loop or out of the loop, right? There's humans in the loop, humans on the loop, humans out of the loop. I think that this doesn't answer your question directly, but it is an observation I want to make. I think that the project management pieces that are at the very early stages are more ripe for humans out of the loop. And the reason is that in some ways the risk in terms of safety risk, in terms of design risk is less. There might be more financial risk at that point, but there isn't tangible physical risk at the early stages of the project. I think as you start to go through, the risk changes and the risk becomes much more physical and a lot less financial. So the McQueenie curve, if people are familiar, the cost to make adjustments, the farther you go down and you go into the project life cycle, the cost to make adjustments increases and your ability to control costs decreases. So we want to make sure that at the early stages of this life cycle, we're spending enough resources because you may be able to completely avoid projects altogether if you're planning correctly and if you're spending more time at the front end of the life cycle. But I also think that it's just interesting to think about risk and AI and how the two might tie together in the project management space. And I think there's a lot of risk management almost of AI itself, this meta kind of risk management that's going on. So yeah, but it's just I think there's a difference in risk between the early stages and the ending stages.
Well, that's really interesting when you think about it. I think, AI is on the top of everyone's mind. How are we going to use it? How are we going to use it effectively? How are we going to make sure it's still safe? And I think it's really important to think about where those human touch points still are to make sure that like a human is checking for safety. That is crucial. Like AI can spit out anything. We can't just assume it's correct. So I think that's a really valid point. And around that, how do you think so like, AI and it's got the advanced analytics, they're becoming more common like we mentioned. It's kind of everywhere now. How are they change how's the AI not just changing the technical work, but the way your teams are collaborating to make decisions? Have you seen anything specific around that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So there's this whole concept of co-intelligence or collective intelligence. And collective intelligence and co-intelligence are almost as if AI becomes somebody on your team. And I think that there are pros and cons to that. I think some of the big cons may be obvious to some. So it means that your team is actually interacting with each other less. So if you think about time as a zero-sum game, they're spending more time collaborating with an AI bot instead of the other people on their team. I think that we've seen that change how collaboration occurs a little bit already. I think the other piece of it that's on the positive side is that questions can get answered, very broad questions can get answered much quicker, and it's not clogging the subject matter experts with questions that may not actually require their expertise. But there's a fine line there, and all this risk management that goes into how AI is integrated into project management is key. The other piece is, at what level should people get AI within your group? So, as an example, if we have some sort of agent that's able to read a plan set and provide QA/QC comments, I'm not claiming that any agent can do this, but let's say that there is an agent theoretically that provides perfect QA/QC. You can't tell the difference between the QA/QC this agent does and a human. Well, if we start to do all the QA/QC using the agent, people are going to not be able to do QA/QC eventually. There's this downscaling of being able to accomplish tasks like QA/QC. And eventually, when those younger engineers become more senior engineers, they're not going to be able to QA/QC the AI agent that's providing the QA/QC. So I think that there may be a vicious cycle here if we're not careful. I'm not saying that AI shouldn't be used for some of these things. I think that it's a wonderful tool. It can compress our timelines considerably. I think it could actually make our accuracy higher. It can make our plan sets much better. But we need to be careful about how we use it, not just in terms of one person individually using it, but how the company's policy around AI shapes how we work together.
I think that is such a wonderful point, especially because when you're younger, you just have to go through the process to learn it, to do better. When you're starting out, like, there are these gruesome tasks that take forever, but the only way to really learn them and get better at them and understand them completely is to get dirty with it and get in there and work the problem. But if AI just takes that for you, then what do you do? You can no longer think critically about the answer, right? Because you don't know how it got there. It's just like showing your math homework, the work on the background. Like, how did we get there? Well, I don't know, so I can't go back and check this. And that's
Exactly.
personally, that's my slippery slope with the AI. But also, like, how do we use that as a tool to build that knowledge base and also make us more efficient? Is the balance I've been seeing people struggle with.
I completely agree. And one other point I'd make is our field, especially in utilities, it's critical that we're able to act without things like internet, the electricity, access to these models. And if we start downskilling people to the point where they're reliant on these models to make decisions, we've created a workforce that may not be as resilient to disasters, in my
That's a
view.
that's a very
And
good
I think,
point.
yeah,
If
and
the internet
it's
can't turn on, we don't have the AI, and now what are we gonna do?
Yeah, I do think that there are some ways around that. People are looking at how do we have these models that are local, but it seems like quite a bit of effort to have a local model that's able to help you in a time of disaster.
Just goes to show you those critical thinking skills will always be in. So when you're thinking about project managers working on aging utility systems, I'm stepping a little bit away from the AI, but what practical strategies will help them balance innovation and reliability and regulatory compliance?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So I think innovation and regulatory compliance. I actually think there are many innovations that are being pushed because regulatory requirements are becoming more and more. Uh, they're becoming more difficult to achieve. I think PFAS as an example. I think of a lot of things that are happening in biosolids, a lot of things that are happening on the collection system side. I don't think innovation would be where it is if it wasn't pushed by regulatory compliance. A lot of work through consent orders, a lot of FEMA work pushes the boundary because of requirements that may not be achievable today. And that can be a good thing and a bad thing. But some requirements that may not be achievable today, when they're set, it pushes us to innovate to that boundary. And then you had the third pillar. I can't remember the third. I got hung up on those
Oh,
two. I'm
sorry, I
sorry.
asked too many things all at once.
No, you're good.
Oh, how are we balancing with the reliability and regulatory compliance? So the innovation with the reliability.
With reliability. Yeah. I don't want to bring AI into everything, but
No,
I
we
do think
can.
this
I,
is
I think
another.
everybody's thinking about it anyway. So let's talk about it.
Yeah. So there are two sides to this. The innovation has always innovation requires risk, almost by definition. If we are not taking risks, we're not innovating. Those two things are at, you know,
Paradox.
yeah, it's a paradox. So when we think about AI and we think about reliability, some people, I believe, may want to over-regulate, and we're actually bringing the boundary of innovation backwards. And there are some examples of regulations that are looking at machine learning, deep learning as an example. And a lot of those sorts of fields have been around for a long time.
I guess, well, I think you're on track with how you're rebalancing the innovation and the reliability with regulatory compliance. Cause I think it's important to think about, like you said, you can't, there has to be risk to innovation, but there also, compliance is making us be more innovative, right? So you can't, it's forcing you to, because why would somebody invest more money and time in creating something new if there wasn't a standard they had to meet to do it, right? Like,
Right.
that's capitalism. So
Yeah.
and so it does create, it spurs that innovation. I think that all feels right on track to me. Like it all kind of feeds itself. I assume in utilities, the reliability factor is key. So it all kind of comes together in this big melting pot of trying to keep up with the regulations and also make sure we're doing good in general. Does that feel fair?
Yeah, that does feel fair. And maybe one thing I'd add is asset management, which in some places is very cutting edge, and in other places this is considered, 10, 20 years old. But asset management as a framework helps us with reliability and it helps us with innovation both. And what I mean is if we can't measure our assets, if we don't really have a great understanding of what our assets are doing, we can't make them more reliable and we can't innovate. So having a basis for utilities, having a basic understanding of what assets they have, how are they operating, what's their GIS like, when were they last replaced, having a good work order management system. There are all these different pillars that utilities need. And if they don't have a good sense of those basic data sets, it's very difficult for them to innovate. And it's also difficult for them to be reliable. I think this like measure act framework is key. And if you aren't measuring your assets, it's very hard for you to act in a way that could be reliable.
Yeah, see, that seems like a great place for AI is like keeping track, like all that data and that kind of thing. I don't know, I could be wrong, but that feels like a great place to utilize the power of AI.
Completely agree. And utilities have an unbelievable amount of data. If you think about water consumption, all of the billing for a long period of time for everybody in a system, all the SCADA data that needs to go into this, all the chemical dosing data, the GIS data, the work order data. There's so many different data sets. And I think that we have created an environment where we are producing more data than we can consume. And ultimately, there are one of two things that have to happen. We either have to generate less data, which I am not a proponent of. I think that will lead to regression in how we treat our utilities, or we have to come up with systems that let us ingest this data better. There are some caveats. I think sometimes we are collecting data for the sake of collecting data. So, for instance, if we're making decisions on a data set and those decisions are made on an annual basis and we're ingesting the data every millisecond, maybe this data set was too large. It's being ingested at a frequency that's too much for really what our use case is. Yeah, I agree that collecting all this data is great for AI, and we need to use AI if we're going to have
But
this.
then we have to digest
We
it.
have to digest it. Yeah, this knowledge transfer that has to go on. For younger engineers, myself being one, all the SOPs that are in a utility, it doesn't matter how brilliant you are, how much you can read. Nobody has the capacity to read all the SOPs in the utility anymore. They're just too many. So we have to start condensing them. And I think AI is one of the tools that we can use to condense.
Yeah, I think data management in general is, we get, like you said, there's all this data. We collect so much data, but it is a true skill and craft to be able to look at it and discern what it means. Cause you can make up a lot of things. Like, statistics 101, right? You can make up a graph that, that tells the story you want it to tell if you stretch it the right way. But then having someone, I think that's a special skill set too, statistician who can look at the data and actually tell a story with it is so important. So as we're talking about AI collecting it, that's where I think we always come back to like we need a person who knows how to tell the story of what that data means. And that just takes experience, right? You have to look at that kind of data over and over again to start to see the trends and know what you're looking for and what is an outlier in this case, which outlier actually matters. So I think I'm sure that there's like a trend on how AI is going to help us with that too. But it's
Well, completely agree. And that storytelling piece is interesting too, because there are many different modes of telling stories and data and utilities. I think there are two main groups. There's GIS, there's the geospatial data, and then there's the temporal data, there's the time series data. Maybe you could make an argument that there's a third, and it's just like summarized data, kind of like your reference tables and things like that. But all three of those require different stories. So geospatial data are stories that we usually tell in GIS. We tell them spatially. The time series data we tell temporally. We show trends like you're talking about, trending, forecasting, predictions. Those are generally the stories that are told. And then the summary data usually kind of helps us bridge the gap between all these different things and have the KPIs that help make big strategic level decisions. But I completely agree that the storytelling piece is critical, and it's critical for project management too. If you think about earned value, I think earned value is in some way tied to the story of what needs to be done for the project. And being able to tie the numbers from the project management side to the numbers that you're providing for clients, telling the stories that need to happen between those two, making sure that everything makes sense together is a big part of just being a good project manager.
Yeah, that communication piece is so important in project management, which brings me kind of to my next question as we've drifted off into our data nerd talk. When projects do begin to drift off course, what do you think some early warning signs PM should pay attention to like small issues before they become major setbacks while we're thinking about how all this data and all this utility information tracks into projects?
Yeah, that's a really good question too. So there are a few ways of looking at it. There's the financial way, which I think a lot of project managers use. It's the easiest flag. You can, if you use, there are different ways of looking at data. If you look at earned value method as
Earned
an
value is
example,
there. It's always there for you.
yeah, yeah. If you look at earned value and you look at your estimated time to complete, you look at what your percentage bill is. There are a lot of different flags. You can create these big decision trees, and at the end of the day, you can have a flag that says we have a problem on some phase or task. And I think that that's a great tool. Sometimes it's over relied on. I think that it's not always an indicator. There are always different things that could be told in the project. But ultimately, I think all projects come down to three things. It's budget, it's scope, and it's time frame, right? Those are the three things. And you can only ever really have two of those.
It's a
There's sort of a
triangle.
trade-off. Yeah, it's triangle. You can't have something that's cheap, done instantly, and it's a gigantic scope. That
Good,
just
fast,
doesn't
cheap. You only
happen.
get 2. You gotta pick 2.
Right. You got to pick two. And I think really good project managers are able to kind of boil all the problems in the world down to that triangle and decide which one they're going to not have for that phase or what that task or whatever and communicate it clearly. I think really good project managers are good at that. And that goes beyond the numbers because, scope is hard to boil down to a number. I think budget and schedule you can boil them down to numbers, but I think scope is just difficult. There are usually qualitative aspects to a scope.
I love that. I never walk away from my project management triangle. It's literally part of my everyday life at home, in the office. I'm like, "Oh, well, we could fix this thing in our house by ourselves. It'll be cheap. It'll be good, but it's gonna take a while. Or we could pay someone to do it tomorrow. It's gonna cost more. It'll be good, but it'll be done tomorrow." It's like that is everything in my life can boil down as a project manager. I can't turn it off. What are
Right.
which two sides of the triangle are we picking today?
Yep. And I think when you start to see, I guess to answer your question directly, when you start to see that two of those sides are failing, two of the
That's a
three
problem.
pieces of the triangle, that's the flag,
Yeah,
right? If
that
it's one, that's probably okay because
that's
that's just
normal. Then one of
normal,
them's not gonna happen.
right? But if it's two or three, you've got a big
I
problem.
like that one. That really distills it down to very simple. If you've got two sides of your triangle going, then it's you gotta fix something quick before it all falls apart. Well, let me ask you one final question. So, for firm leaders listening today, if you could improve just one thing to strengthen project outcomes, where do you think they should start?
I really think there's a focus on people that needs to still occur. I mean, if I'm a big technology person. I believe that there are a lot of technologies that can be adapted and help us perform better, but it's still ultimately people, how people work together, how people work effectively together, playing to their strengths. There's a lot of just people management components that I hope are always at the forefront. There are a lot of pieces to project management that lead to the success of a firm. The financial aspect is a big one. But ultimately, I think people feeling fulfilled, people feeling like they're doing something for their community, people feeling like they're making a positive impact, those lead to successful projects. I think if people don't feel like they're in the right role, you will notice that your project will start to have issues.
I like that a lot. I think the thing we're always saying at EMI is that project management, the thing we forget about a lot is that it's people, right? If you want a project to get done, you've got to manage those people. You've got a lot of people who are very good at all their technical tasks. Getting them all to get it done together requires a boatload of soft skills that a lot of us we've ended up as project managers because we had those technical skills and we're really good at it, and someone's like, "Oh, you should lead this." But then you have to translate those technical skills into, "Okay, now I'm directing people through their technical skills. I'm no longer I need to let go of how much I like those technical skills and my comfort zone of doing them and work with other people to get it done." And that's a tricky transition, but if firms focus up front on, like, helping people with those skills, that transition could just be so much smoother.
Yeah, but I agree. And I think how the technology piece of how technology and people are going to work together is becoming more and more important too. But I think we can't lose sight of people being the priority in that
Yeah, at the end of
conversation.
the day, we're all just human. We have to focus on the people.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining me, William. This was wonderful. I appreciate your time, and thanks for joining us today on
Thank
the
you.
podcast.
Thank you so much. I enjoyed it.
Please remember, you can find the show notes for this episode at aecpmpodcast.com. There you'll find a summary of the key points discussed in today's episode, as well as links to any of the resources, websites, or books mentioned during this episode. Until next time, I wish you all the best in your engineering project management endeavors.